I did want to go through one more topic with you.
Absolutely.
I honestly feel like I could do this for like another 2 hours, 3 hours.
Ask away. I'm happy to make content.
So one thing for me that you had mentioned over the phone that I think is super interesting. One, because I'm someone who really likes to think about the deep, thoughts, the bigger picture. Whether, some people would say it's theology and some people would call it strictly scientific. Other people would call it philosophic. You had mentioned that you like to discuss the philosophy of blockchain. And I guess for starters, if there is a way to sum up what you mean by the philosophy of blockchain, and I would also like to just dive in and talk a little bit about it.
The first thing that comes to mind, one universal truth. That's precisely the case. I would say that that's one universal measurable truth as given by humans. Technically speaking, everything around us is already a sort of like universal truth. This microphone, it's what it's made out of. Its physical construction, its material and molecular state right now is technically a universal truth. It exists. It has relation to everything else around it, right? Just as like this pillow, when I apply kinetic pressure to it, it deforms and changes accordingly, right? So there is a sort of truth in everything in the universe. The question being for us as humans is, how do we now begin to log every single change that has ever happened? When I injured myself, a couple of days ago, that was technically an immutable process. It had already happened. I can't go back and uninjure myself, right? But if I'm able to understand the mechanism by which, for example, my body undergoes a healing factor and see, okay, this is now how biology works, right? I'm able to go back and look at the history of something and be able to adequately measure its atomic state, right? I think the philosophy of blockchain is being able to measure atomic state at any given time with, as a single source of truth. Am I saying that we'll be able to go and eventually compute? I sometimes joke with people, it's like, hey, eventually blockchain will be able to use to calculate every single molecular state of every single atom and molecule and quark and gluon that has ever existed, right? I say that half jokingly, but in reality, it's like to be able to calculate with and to have granularity on that level and be able to have history of that. Like, for example, what was the kinetic energy of the meteor that wiped out the dinosaurs? What was its mass and shape, right? Like, we don't have the ability to understand or measure this. Like, we can have some evidence of it, obviously, but we don't have like in the moment evidence of it because we didn't necessarily have cameras running while we were there, right? So the notion being is blockchain as a universal source of truth can allow everything else to derive off that. Just like the kilogram example that I mentioned before. Instead of now having a single source of truth, from a physical weight or from a universal calculated constant, we now have a more complex table of universal values that mutate over time, and all of those mutations in values are publicly visible. Whether it's everything from stock prices to the state of your own personal health, if you're doing blood tests, to all the way to time, right? Chronology, right? Because everyone's perception of time could be warped even slightly, right? Saturday nights when you're drunk. Let's admit it. But it's just things like that, which when you have a single universal reference for everything, or as much as you can, you can really start to begin building deterministic and consistent systems, which for humans is the one thing that we are not good at being, is we're not good at fundamentally being like logical and deterministic all the time. We're human. After all, that's a human condition. We're not perfectly predictable. If we were, we'd be machines. So it helps us take, this actually goes into my thought process. Actually, I was having a really interesting conversation. Do you know Tay Zonde, the creator of Chocolate Rain?
Yeah.
I was having a very interesting conversation with him for 2.5 hours.
With Tay Zonde?
Tay Zonde, yeah. No lie. I have a tweet about it. But it's interesting because our conversation essentially boiled down to two things. If we as humans cannot expand our lifespan, we must quicken our computing, right? And in order for us to begin to do that, we need some form of consistency. We need some form of baseline for that. We need some ability to detach like our logical processing from our biochemical human biases, right? Emotional, physical, death, mortality, all this stuff, from the actual logical processing that goes on. And that becomes when we separate out the logical processing and the memory and everything else, that's what AI, blockchain, IoT, that's what all of those do really well. And we can then focus on what it means to be truly human. What does it mean to really feel an emotion or to fall in love or to enjoy the things that really matter in life, right? Because if we've already perfected computing, right? I'm not saying we've perfected it, so to speak, but we've already relegated a lot of our memory and calculation process to computing in that sense. So now we can focus on what actually is meaningful to us as humans in life, right? I think that's the end of it. That's the end goal of all of this, is that by creating machine consistency, we've carved out the space for us to feel safe in being inconsistent. We can truly express ourselves now as humans. We don't have to worry about being perfectly logical and memorizing everything all the time, because we have perfect memory, machine memory of everything that has and perhaps ever will be, right?
We don't need hundreds of people in one building pushing papers and slowly losing the meaning of living. Mm-hmm. I love how you're connecting to just a deeper understanding of, like you said, what it is to be human, to express yourself as openly and as genuinely as you can. And I love how the philosophy of blockchain in your eyes has that end goal for you as well.
It is perfect consistency because, at the end of the day, when something is perfectly consistent, you can build. It's kind of like, I believe it was Picasso once said, learn the rules like a lawyer so you can break them like an artist. So if the rules are already laid out for you, you can build human lifestyle around very ordained machine rules. But simply because that if you as a human tried to tackle those rules in the first place, it would just literally be suboptimal. It would be not efficient for the calculation of a human to do so, because, yeah. But yeah, it's meaning of life is something that, I think everyone ponders at some point. But I think if there's a way that we can codify the meaning of life into either a separation of concerns for the meaning of life, aka the things that matter to us as humans and the things that matter to machines, right? The things that matter to machines is us typing in Excel spreadsheets, right? That's what matters to corporate entities and filings and, finance algorithms and everything else. But if we're talking about what it means to take 80, 90 years of biological life, or just be able to enjoy, what does it mean to, exist for a certain amount of time, with consciousness and everything else. That involves a different set of questions that may not necessarily involve logic. And I think one of the deep roots of human sorrow is when these two are in conflict with each other. The logical part is forcing the human, biochemical, emotional part it's coercing it to do something other than what it wants. And now that you have this conflict, you have now existential dread. So that is what I think technology like this is extremely good for, is for reconciling the differences between perfect machine consistency, logos, etc., animus, and human emotional meaning of life, biochemical relations, aka anima. What is the soul and spirit of being human in a very humanistic sense, not necessarily religious sense.